Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, one of our virtual evening programs. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director, and with us on screen is Tess Galen, our Events Coordinator, Front Desk Administrator, and Employee Extraordinaire, who helps keep everything running so smoothly. Tonight, we also have a special guest. We're thrilled to have Denise Gigante here, and I will introduce her properly in just a moment. If you are brand new to the Athenaeum and have never attended one of our programs or stepped inside our amazing building, want to welcome you tonight and hope that if you enjoy what you hear tonight, which is right in line with what we are about, we are a library, a circulating library, a rare collections library, a research archive, a programming space, and a community for people who love books and who love to learn. I hope if this is your first visit, or if you have been coming to programs for a while and not become a member, that you will either call us or come in and visit or go to our website and look at becoming a member of our amazing community. We would love to count you among our members. Tonight, it is a joy to welcome Denise Gigante, who is the Sadie Durham Professor of Humanities at Stanford University. Her most recent book is what she's going to talk about tonight, is Book Madness, a story of book collectors in America. And it was made possible with research, with fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Bibliographical Society of America, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the Society of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. Right now, she's completing a book called The Mental Traveler, a Blakean pilgrimage through medieval and Renaissance iconography, based on her Clarendon lectures at Oxford University that she gave in 2020. It's going to be published with 125 color illustrations by Oxford University Press. Sounds like a real treat for the eye and the mind. And also she's co-editing the Cambridge History of the British Essay, which is a 50-chapter study of the essay genre for Cambridge University Press, which will be released in 23-24. She has also published in 2011, among other books, a book on the Keats brother, John and George. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Denise, and I'll invite you, if you have any questions at any time, put them in the chat in the Q&A, and I will moderate them at the end of our conversation. But please join me in warmly welcoming Denise to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Beth. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope this is all going to come through nice and easily. Okay, so so the talk today is from this recent book. Was released actually just in January in the UK, in November in the US. And it's a story of book collectors in America. It looks at the culture, well, the really bookish culture of mid-19th century America and the making of American literary tradition and other things. But today, this talk is going to focus on bibliography, bibliophilia, and bibliomania in the mid-19th century, particularly. And so I am just, without further ado, going to plunge right in to make sure we have time for questions. Okay, so here you have the beautiful Athenaeum reading room that you just saw behind Beth. And this is from the website. Welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. The Athenaeum was established in 1814 as a subscription library at a time when the free public library system did not exist, and collections of books available for reading or research were still mostly limited to institutions, schools, or colleges. And to that, we might add a good number of private collectors who really built the collections upon which US institutional libraries were founded. But this is a really nice way to sum up the situation at mid-century in the US. There was no public library system. So people used their own initiative to circulate books, to engage in cultural discussion, to sponsor lectures, and, as the Athenaeum is still doing. At the time, again, mid-19th century, the Harvard Library was the largest library in the United States. It had 72,000 volumes. It had been moved. Actually, it had been burned. A fire had swept through Harvard Hall and destroyed all the books that weren't out for circulation. So in the late 18th century, the library began reaccumulating books, and by mid-century, they had the greatest collection in the U.S. And yet, if you compare that with the size of European college libraries, it sort of pales in comparison. So Cambridge University, which is at least the architectural model for Harvard, had 166,724 books. And if you look at the Göttingen Library, which was a center of European learning at the time in Germany, there were 360,000 volumes. The Göttingen Library is not insignificant. It is the place where the figure we'll come back to at the end of the talk, Joseph Green Cogswell, who was the Harvard librarian around 1814, at the time the Athenaeum was founded, he imported from the Göttingen Library the card catalog system. That's why we have it in the United States. Previously, all catalogs for libraries were printed, which was an incredible amount of labor and very often superfluous, since any new acquisitions had to be either added in by hand and the whole thing reprinted. So the card catalog was a much more flexible system. He found a lot of resistance at Harvard, but once introduced, it caught flames in the US. The second category of libraries, so this is the university library system. The national library system was equally behind. The Library of Congress was the US national collection. It was in the Smithsonian Institution. And in 1846, it was officially founded by an act of Congress. And it had about 50,000 volumes at mid-century. But the British Museum, which was a public library it was the British public collection. You can see the difference here, 435,000, doubled if you cross the channel and go to Paris, where the book collections of religious institutions had merged with those of aristocratic and national into this almost million volume collection by mid-century. Yale Library was all the way down with 21,000 books, but again, Oxford was up there with 220,000. So that's the landscape of US libraries at mid-century. So this guy, Luther Farnham, who was a Bostonian educator, did a tour of private collections in the US to catalog them and to remark what was remarkable about individual collections, which often equaled the size if they didn't surpass institutional collections. And at mid-century, he concluded that this country is sadly in want of books. We can boast a land stretching from sea to sea with the greatest varieties of climate, soil, and productions. But what visitor crosses the sea to view our libraries? Who has ever heard of them abroad, except their diminutive size and meager character has given them a bad eminence? That's quotation from Paradise Lost. We have not a single library with 100,000 volumes, while there are several in Europe with 5 times this number of books and 1 or 2 with 1 million more. So we might think, well, size isn't all, but in a sense, for a research library, it is. As bibliographers stressed over and over again, it's not that each book on a library shelf needs to be used by all the patrons of a library. It's that when you need to find something for serious research, it's there, whether that's historical research or research for, say, fiction or what have you. And many believe that the country could not progress in its culture until it established a more reliable book world, book access to books. This guy, Henry Stevens Jr. of Vermont, was probably the person who did more than anyone else to stock the libraries of US institutions with old books from Europe. And he built almost single-handedly the entire American collection of the British Library. Hundreds of thousands of volumes crossed the sea in both directions, thanks to Henry Stevens. His clients were bibliomaniacs like John Carter Brown, who built the Brown University Library, or the John Carter Brown Library, James Lennox of New York, whose collection ultimately went to the making of the New York Public Library, and Peter Force, who is building the collection of American archives that are now in the Smithsonian, and part of the special collections of the Library of Congress. So Henry Stevens was interviewed at mid-century by the British House of Parliament, who had formed a committee on public libraries. They wanted to study the public library system and see what they could do better. So they were comparing themselves to other countries. And they interviewed Stevens to ask about the kinds of libraries in the US. And he identified not public library systems, but the National Library of Congress, the individual state libraries, public or government libraries at the level of town, city, village, Athenaeum and Lyceum libraries, subscription or independent libraries. Athenaeums and Lyceums were subscription libraries, but they weren't the only kind. Mercantile and apprentice libraries at mid-century were hugely important. Historical and antiquarian society libraries that were building the collections needed to write American history really for the first time. And then educational libraries at the level of the university, college, the academy and common school, and then Sunday schools and congregational libraries. These were all filling the gaps of supplying the American reading public with reading material. When the chair of the library committee in Parliament asked Henry Stevens about these subscription libraries, and he was thinking in this particular case of the Boston Athenaeum, the chair asked, are subscription and joint stock libraries open to everybody without any introduction? And Stevens responded that they were free to subscribers or shareholders by right and others by courtesy. And the chair asks, do not subscribers demur to persons who do not subscribe having access to the library? No, I think not. Their object is to show the library and to gain subscribers. May a person read for any length of time in one of those subscription libraries? He may be tolerated by courtesy for a short time only, for a few months. On the continent, a person may go and read for a whole year without being objected to by anybody. That is not the case in the libraries you're speaking of. In many of the larger libraries, he may do so. So you can see how subscription libraries were often founded with a public purpose, and they were, but at the same time, they were semi-public. They were and they were not. The oldest one of these in the US is the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded by Franklin, many of you will know, in 1731, as a way of gathering together a large number of books for people who are interested in culture. You could, if you were in, say, a manual laborer, you could use the library after hours. You could use the reading room. You could also borrow a book. If you had enough money to leave a deposit for the book, you too could borrow the book. And I think they might have charged a penny. So there was a public mission, and there was also the fact that if you weren't a subscriber, you didn't have all the borrowing privileges of the members. The mercantile library associations I mentioned were important. They were hugely important. You know, at the time, most people finished school, most men finished school at the age of 11 or 14, and then went to work. And of course, women's education wasn't even on the table for the most part. And so if you wanted an education, it was largely a matter of self-education. You needed to spend your hours after work reading and filling in information that you didn't have access to. And many, many people at the time saw this as a value. This was an important thing for them to do. And they did go after hours to libraries that were available to them if they were in commerce, if they were in trade, they were a merchant. The mercantile libraries were great resources. The Mercantile Library of New York, with 27,000 volumes, had, again, more than the Yale University Library at the time. Boston was rapidly trying to catch up to New York. And here you have images of the inside, the reading halls of the New York and Boston Mercantile Libraries. And you can see how it was a place to meet others who were interested in culture and to have literary conversations. That's how people talked about it. To read the papers as well as whatever books you might want to page. George Palmer Putnam, largely responsible for a huge impetus behind a specific American literary tradition in the 1840s, started his career at the age of 16 in New York as a bookseller's clerk, basically. He would go to the bookstore, he would sell books. After hours, he spent all of his time at the Mercantile Library taking notes on history, on sort of literary subjects, and he compiled all of those notes for others in 1833 into this book that he published called Chronology, Introduction and Index to Universal History, Biography, and Useful Knowledge. And you can see, therefore, the impact of these libraries on a major American publisher at the time, somebody who was responsible not just for publishing, but for gathering a network of American authors together as a kind of cultural space. You can also see how a lot of these reading rooms were designed on classical models, and the idea was, as it was in cathedrals, largely these were based on cathedrals, whether it was Gothic architecture or the neoclassical style temple that you see here, or the Hagia Sophia, the large Byzantine cathedral. Uplifting, you're entering a space where there's something bigger than yourself and your own material concerns. It was supposed to be a space to inspire as well as to provide basic information. And then last level down, but no less important, were the apprentice libraries. So if you hadn't yet graduated from your apprenticeship and you weren't yet a working man of commerce, you could use these apprentice libraries. These are the two from New York. One is in Manhattan, one was in Brooklyn. They sponsored classes, they hosted lectures, and they provided members with books. And Mark Twain, who started his career not as an author, but as a printer, or rather a printer's apprentice, in 1853, wrote to his mother, "The printers have 2 libraries in town, entirely free to the craft, and in those I can spend my evenings most pleasantly. If books are not good company, where will I find it?" Okay, now, just to underscore the idea that reading was part of really a whole project of self-culture and self-education, a lifelong project. We have continuing studies programs today, but it's not quite the universal thing that it was intended to be, and in fact, to a large degree was in the 19th century. William Ellery Channing articulated the ideas that were picked up later by a lot of librarians of the importance of books, and the phrase self-culture became popular. So this lecture that he gave as the introductory lecture of 1838 to the Franklin lectures, which were lectures on all subjects from science to history, codified the phrase and made the idea of self-culture really popular. And why the Franklin lectures? Well, Ben Franklin was the model of American self-culture. He was at once a mechanic, right? So he was a printer's apprentice. He was a manual laborer. At the same time, through books and through his interaction with books, you can see him on the right as the man of politics, as an author, as an intellectual. And so the rise through books is made possible and is visualized in the case of Franklin. And Franklin saw himself his identity so bound up with books that he composed his own epitaph. You could call it a bibliographical epitaph. It wasn't actually used. He was only 22 when he wrote this. But you can see the body of Ben Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author, God, right? So here is Edward Everett, who was an important figure in a bibliomaniac himself. He was part of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he gave the introductory address for the first of the Franklin Lectures. And he explains they have been called the Franklin Lectures in honor of our distinguished townsman, the immortal Franklin, the son of a tallow chandler and the apprentice to a printer in this town, a man who passed all his early years and a very considerable portion of his life in manual industry, and who was chiefly distinguished by his zealous and successful efforts for the promotion of useful knowledge. This was, the Franklin Lectures were held in Boston, but other major cities picked up on them and opened Franklin societies. Providence, Rhode Island had a Franklin Society, gave its own Franklin Lectures. And this guy who's in my book was a bibliophile who modeled himself on Franklin to an extreme extent. He also was a manual laborer whose work resulted in books, except in his case, he cured sheepskins. So he produced his work, curing skins, produced the bindings that went into the majority of law bindings for law books, but also other books as sold by the bookstore of Little and Brown in Cambridge and many other Bostonian bookstores. So he contributed in that way, but in his private life, he was a bibliophile. I don't think I'd go so far as to call him a bibliomaniac, and I'll talk about the difference between them, but he was nicknamed by the Harvard Collegians LLD, which is of course the title for a law graduate, but here we have it as a joke for the learned leather dresser. Dowse made no pretensions, like Franklin, to be anything other than he was, and he admitted in speaking with Edward Everett, he said, "I never had any means but the wages of a journeyman leather dresser at $25 per month. I had never paid $5 for conveyance from one place to another. I had never worn a pair of boots, but I was at that time in the possession of several hundred good books, well bound." So that's the beginning of Thomas Dowse's collection, which is now here in the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's the central meeting room of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And it's basically Thomas Dowse's collection intact as he had it, with custom cases made for it, an image of Dowse hanging amidst it, and then busts of all the kind of inspirational literary and historical figures that inspired his own self-culture. He spent all of his time reading, and he earned enough from his, this was his shop, he earned enough from leather dressing to build this mansion in Central Square, Cambridge. And he built his library above it. So this was the largest room in his house. It was a gathering place for intellectuals in London, in Cambridge and Boston. And yet there he was every day below his library at work. And George Beryl Emerson, who was a cousin of the transcendental philosopher and poet, says, "For many years and many times in a year, I have passed by the shop of a diligent, industrious mechanic, whom I have often seen busy at his trade, with his arms bare, hard at work." And so you can see how the hours caught, the leisure time was hard bought and well used. And there was an imperative to use one's leisure time well. Dowse built to Franklin the second monument to Franklin in the United States. The first one was above the central door of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It shows Franklin in a toga, as he wanted to be shown. This is an obelisk in granite erected by Thomas Dowse to the memory of Benjamin Franklin. The printer comes first, the philosopher, the patriot, who by his wisdom blessed his country and his age and bequeathed to the world an illustrious example of industry, integrity, and self-culture. So again, the printer and the philosopher are connected, and you can see how Dowse had intended, and in fact, it is this way, that the Franklin obelisk mirrors his own, right? Because he saw himself as a a man of self-culture, whose great act of philanthropy was to bequeath his library of 5,000 good books, good editions of good books, to the Massachusetts Historical Society, which at the time had a pretty pathetic, ratty collection. Now, men like George Palmer Putnam and Thomas Dowse are an example of American bibliophilia, men who were working and then working hard on the sidelines really to gain culture. And the way to do that was principally through books. Now, bibliomania was an extreme pathologized form of book love. And I would say it differs from bibliophilia in two main respects. One, that the book as an object really is privileged. Bibliophiles love books, but they also just love reading. But these are specific copies of specific books. And also, it's not just quantity, it's also quantity. Quantity matters for the bibliomaniac. You want to have a lot, you want to have as many books as you can. So that's why it was kind of jokingly called a mania. And it is something that really kind of gets going in at the turn of the 19th century in Britain, but by the mid-19th century, it's in the US too. So we have this diarist, George Templeton Strong, who chronicled the history of New York in the 1840s extremely well in his diary, say that New York in 1839 already is certainly infected with the bibliomania. You can see the word infected is playing on this idea of a pathology. I never saw anything like the eagerness to buy and the prices given. And he admits bibliomania is a kind of a constitutional disease with me. I've been subject to it almost as long as I can remember, and that's 1842. And it's good to keep in mind that the auctions in the US, unlike in Britain, were after hours. They were held in the evenings so that people after work could go to them, buy books, and socialize. They were well furnished places, they were comfortable, they were places to be and be seen, and they created a kind of environment of the book world as entertainment also. This is the guy, if we go back to bibliomania as it emerged in Britain in the early 19th century, we have to look at this guy, Richard Heber. He's the fiercest of all and the strongest of all the bibliomaniacs, the poet Thomas Campbell called him. Richard Heber was legendary in his book buying. There was nobody to equal him. Many bibliomaniacs would fill a house with books, and they would be laughed at for like sleeping in their hallway. Heber filled 9 houses with books. Okay, one of them was Hodnet Hall, which was his ancestral residence in Shropshire. He had 2 huge houses in London that he filled with books. And then he had a house everywhere he went on his book buying expedition. So the European book world was very interconnected at the time. So he had a house in Paris, Louvain, Leiden, The Hague, Brussels, Antwerp. And indeed, after his death, people went to all of them to try to uncover his will to figure out what he wanted to do with all of his books. Oddly, he left no will with any word about his books. He left a little money to his relatives, so they all went to the hammer. But Thomas Frognall Dibdin, who is the bibliographer responsible for the popularity of the Bibliomania, chronicled his first visit to Heber's house in Pimlico. And he had known Heber 14 years, but Heber had never invited him in. After his death, Dibdin entered the home and he said, I had never seen rooms, cupboards, passages, and corridors so choked, so suffocated with books. Treble rows were here, double rows were there, hundreds of slim quartos, several upon each other, were longitudinally placed over thin and stunted duodecimos, reaching up from one extremity of a shelf to another, up to the very ceiling, the piles of volumes extended, while the floor was strewed with them in loose and numerous heaps. Heber had a lot of money. He spent it all on books. He was known to go 500 miles in quest of a single volume. He, in one trip to Paris, snapped up a library of 30,000 volumes. He was the model of largesse, of aristocratic largesse, the bibliomaniacal large scale. That was not popular. That was not possible really in the US. The US buyers didn't have that kind of money. You had someone like James Lennox, who inherited a fortune, who followed in Richard Heber's path, whose collection went toward the New York Public Library, and the John Jacob Astor Library, whose money went toward founding the Astor Library. So one made money in real estate, the other was, I think, in shipbuilding. But Lennox followed Richard Heber's philosophy that one copy of a book was never enough. So why you see, he says, no man can comfortably do without 3 copies of a book. One he must have for his show copy, another he will require for his own use and reference, and unless he is inclined to part with this, which is very inconvenient, or risk injury of his best copy, he must needs have a third at the service of his friends. This quotation circulates all over the place, and I've given enough of these talks now to know that there are probably some bibliomaniacs out there. And in my last talk at the Antiquarian Booksellers Fair in Pasadena, I had an audience member say, oh, well, this is good. Now we know we only need 3 copies of the book because bibliomaniacs frequently purchase multiple. Okay, so I guess we have about 15 minutes left. So let me just go through the Bibliomania and then turn back to the New York Public Library. So the Bibliomania was popularized by Dibdin, the bibliographer to the stars, to the aristocrats, in this book, The Bibliomania of 1809, subtitled, or Book Madness, containing some account of the history, symptoms, and cure of this fatal disease, in an epistle addressed to Richard Heber, Esquire, by Thomas Frognall Dibdin. This was not the first book titled The Bibliomania addressed to Richard Heber in 1809. There was a verse epistle also addressed to him, but this one caught fire. This was very, very popular, this book. Everybody loved it. The title page here has a copy of the book Fool. Go back to that in a minute. And the quotation from the book Fool in Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools. Still, says the book Fool, still I am busy books assembling, for to have plenty it is a pleasant thing in my conceit, and to have them always in hand, but what they mean, I do not understand. And so he's depicted here not reading the book on his desk, but brushing it, right? Keeping it clean, admiring its pages, knowing nothing about its contents. So that's the medieval caricature of the book Fool as bibliomaniac. And again, it comes from Sebastian Brandt's Das Narrenschiff, which was translated into Latin 3 years after its publication, 1497, and then into English by Alexander Barclay in 1509. This is Albrecht Dürer's woodcut showing the book Fool. So you can see he's not just here with his giant folio and his brush and his fool's cap. He's at a desk full of books with shelves behind him full of books. And people like criticize Dibdin for, playing fast and loose with the designs that he used in his own books. He was too creative with them. You can't just take a detail like this, but clearly Dibdin's emphasis was on this image of the book Fool. Like the books were kind of a given for him. And there's an in-joke, right? And the in-joke is this, that it's the credit of these lines on the title page aren't given to the author of the book. They're not given to the translator. They're given to the printer. This is Pinson's. This is Richard Pinson's Ship of Fools, and it's the 1509 edition. That's where these lines are from. Only a bibliomaniac, only somebody as fanatic about typeface and other things as Dibdin would care about quoting lines of verse in that manner. So, there's a kind of tongue-in-cheek way in which all of these writings by bibliomaniacs about bibliomaniacs, there's kind of fondness and irony to it. This is an image, this is a plate of the Fools from Pinson's edition of leaping and dancing and follies that pass their time in such vanity. Pinson was also the printer who gave the world Roman type. So the Aldine press of Italy used italic type. Then there was black letter, which came from the German printers. And then Pinson gives us Roman. And the book Fool was also the reason that we have the paper-sized fool's cap. And it goes back to a watermark that the first paper makers used of the book Fool, the fool in his caps. And the book Fool is a good watermark for a paper maker because it's all about the quality of the paper, not the quality of what's going to be printed on it. The two other editions that followed kind of changed the genre of the Book Madness. So in 1811, Dibdin expanded the Bibliomania and gave it a new title. So it was no longer kind of mock medical treatise. Now it was a bibliographical romance in 6 parts, right? So it's the kind of idealized quest romance after the Holy Grail, whatever it is in your field, whether it's the first folio of Shakespeare or a Bay Psalm book, if you're an American antiquarian. It's the quest that excites and you can see that in the case of Heber too. Once the collection was complete, he kind of lost interest in it, right? It was about the quest. And here on the title page, you no longer have a book Fool, but you have an educated reader in the Bodleian Library, full of books, a university library, and a woodcut of a pile of books here. Lastly, 1840, we get the same subtitle, a bibliographical romance, with a new image. It's not the guy in the Bodleian Library. It's now, it's just pure romance, right? It's these kind of Renaissance people on a picturesque boat ride. And the woodcut, the really rough woodcut of the books has now become quite polished. So you can see how this has been kind of co-opted into a bourgeois, almost from, say, an aristocratic in-joke to a bourgeois practice that anybody with a certain sum of money can get into, compile a private gentleman's library. So Dibdin himself, the author, you know, Bibliophilia, writing about books, that kind of bibliography goes back to the mid-14th century in Britain. We have Richard de Bury, who was a bishop, who compiled a book of, not really a book, a manuscript turned into a book, so a codex of 20 essays about book collecting, book preservation, book use. But Dibdin really went to town with bibliography as a creative forum. So you can see he started off with annotated bibliographies in the traditional mode, say the 18th century, but then he went to the Book Madness. Then he went to history. Then he wrote bibliography, a poem, which he intended as an epic. He only printed one book of his epic, but he has the bibliographical Decameron, or 10 Days Pleasant Discourse upon Illuminated Manuscripts, focused on one book. Happens to be the book that the Roxburgh Club was founded to commemorate in 1812, the Waldorfer Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. But this is a dialogue. These are bibliographical, antiquarian, and picturesque tours. So taking the mode of the picturesque tour and turning it into a bibliographical tour. The Library Companion, or the Young Man's Guide to the Old Man and the Old Man's Comfort in the Choice of a Library, kind of conduct book for libraries. Reminiscences of a Literary Life is a kind of bibliographical autobiography, and so forth. So you can see that Dibdin was very, very playful about the mode of bibliography, and he's the reason we have basically sort of bibliojournalism, biblioessayism kind of grows out of this moment. Okay, so one last quotation by Strong, and then we'll end with Joseph Green Cogswell. So I quoted Strong, the diarist, as saying that by 1839, Bibliomania had swept over the Atlantic to New York. This is Strong here. Strong was an attorney who spent all of his money on books. And he distinguishes between two kinds of bibliophilia that I think is really important for the American context. He says, rarity adds to the value of what's good, but alone it's nothing. The technical bibliomania, the pure abstract delirium Dibdinianum that rages after those things simply as book varieties, independently of any interest attaching to the edition, I never was smitten with to any great extent. And it's a good thing for him because it was harder in the US to buy rare old books than it was in Europe and in England. The market had dried up a bit. And so American collectors entered the marketplace trying to form new niches for themselves. One of them was American history. Those books hadn't really been sought after. Or just amassing collections of standard literature in fine editions, which also were not available in this country. But to look for the old copies of Caxton, the early English printer, and these really kind of ancient rare books, because they're old and because they're only one of a kind, wasn't really the American tradition of bibliomania. Okay, now lastly, I would sum up with bibliography in the context of the public library. Joseph Green Cogswell was fairly single-handedly responsible for the Astor Library. He coddled John Jacob Astor for many years, trying to convince him to use his philanthropy to establish a systematic American library of 100,000 books, pretty much the thing that Luther Farnham was calling for, a good, well-organized research library of 100,000 volumes, which the country lacked, available to the public. And he accomplished his mission. It took everything that he had pretty much. And by the end of it all, when the Astor Library opened its doors, Cogswell had become so attached to those books that he had located, acquired, shipped, cataloged, shelved, etc., double-checked, that he moved into the Astor Library. He couldn't be away from them. They gave him a little alcove. So you can see his bedroom here among the stacks of the Astor Library. And there he slept, and he woke up and he went to work. And he usually worked until midnight. Let me see here. Okay, these are my last slides. So I would say that here you can see in Cogswell's career the progress from a bibliophile to a professional bibliographer and what's lost in the progress. So when he was a young man, he trained in the law, and then he went to Belfast, Maine to practice. Belfast, Maine at the time was a very rural town. And he felt while he was there that really his best friends were his books. That's the classic definition of a bibliophile. So he writes to a friend, "I'm now obliged to make books my companions. Conceive how a person of any love for reading would spend his time in a situation where dwelt." He was a little bit of a snob. He didn't think the people in Belfast were interesting enough to converse with. No living being for whom he felt any interest, and surrounded by a multitude of books, conceive of such a person in such a place, and you may at once judge of my occupations and employments. I am quietly seated in the little room back of my office by the side of a fine fire, as I hear the wind whistle and the snow beat violently against my windows. I think of the 1,000 houseless wretches who will have to pass a miserable night, and earnestly wish that the many unoccupied apartments of my habitation might serve them for a shelter. I neither make nor receive visits. Scarce an individual, clients excepted, has entered my door since I returned from Exeter. My books, I believe, are my best friends. But by the time he begins cataloging books for the New York public, he, like a lot of professional book people, including professors at major institutions, universities, no longer have time to read. So we have him now in 1849 saying, "I've spent all the daylight hours of every day in book hunting and book buying, and all the evening hours in seeing what I had done and what I should do next." There's no place where time is more precious than in this large metropolis. He's writing from London, which was the book capital of the English-speaking world. And you must give me the credit of being very generous if I spare you half an hour for a little rambling talk about books. In truth, I could talk about nothing else at present, for during the last 2 months, not an idea has entered my head that was not associated with them. And this you must understand in the material and not the spiritual sense. I've had thousands and thousands of volumes on hand without finding time to read a single page of one. And here he mentions Thomas Macaulay's History of England that he wanted to read. If therefore you have none of the spirit of the bibliophile, stop here and throw this letter into the fire. It will prove as dull to you as a sermon. And he goes on to talk about books. By November 9th, 1856, the New York Public Library had been open since January. He's now 70. And he writes more despairingly. This, by the way, is an image of the stacks of the New York Public Library, probably in the early 20th century. He says, I would not be so stupid if I lived in the world of animated beings instead of being immured here with these dumb, and I'm almost tempted to add another D, damned, books. And dumb in the truest sense they are to me. The ancient fable of Tantalus is a feeble picture of suffering compared with what I have daily to endure. His was only physical, mine is all mental. My thirst for knowledge is as great as anybody's, and here I am all the time up to my chin in a grand reservoir of all that human thought and genius has produced without being able to drink in one drop of it. And seems that Cogswell is suffering from what another bibliophile calls, a later bibliomaniac calls catalogitis. I'm going to define that, and that's where we'll end. Jokingly, the stricken man is observed to keep aloof, the man who has catalogitis. He is abstracted and taciturn and is rarely without a pamphlet in his hand and a pencil in active employment. He does not deliberately refuse food if thrust upon him, but at table, when tempted with his favorite dishes, he's likely to be checking with his pencil in some London price list the books which he would buy if he could see his way to paying for them. So I would say there's an enormous human cost in this kind of philanthropic mid-19th century effort to make books available to the public. So when you sit down next time in the New York Public Library reading room, the invisible labor, is something, this, I would end here, that's going on now, the digitization of books. And I was at a conference recently where librarians basically were trying to figure out how to have their names associated with the books they were cataloging. There's an immense amount of labor that goes into simply providing the materials for scholarship and even pleasure reading. So I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Denise. This is really, really interesting. I think for all of us who, work at libraries or visit and participate, just knowing the extent and the history of this bibliomania and what goes into creating libraries is fascinating. I invite anybody to put questions in the Q&A and the chat, and I will moderate them. And Ed Petit, I know you're there, so I'm looking at you for the question right out of the.
I went 3 minutes over, but I think we have time.
We're good. We're great for time for questions.
Okay.
Great for time for questions. Who was the most fascinating? So that you talked about, a couple folks here, but was there anybody else that really stuck out in your research as a really fascinating bibliomaniac book collector?
So I mentioned two of my favorites. So Cogswell, I have a real soft spot for Cogswell. He's such an eccentric. And also for Henry Stevens of Vermont, who was the man I said shipped a lot of books in both directions, but they were all eccentric. I mean, it's the case that to be a bibliophile of to that extent, I mean, many of the people in my book had collected libraries of 10,000 volumes, who had made enormous sacrifices of families and all, they were all really passionate people. They were really passionate people. So, Robert Balmano, who founded the New York Shakespeare Society, was passionate about, old books relating to Shakespeare. I have a chapter talking about him in relation to William Evans Burton, who was an actor and a theater manager who had built an entire temple to Shakespeare behind his home on Hudson Street in downtown. It was a 3-story octagonal Tudor building with a stained glass dome above it that had every possible edition of Shakespeare, copies of the first 4 folios, Tudor furniture, relics. It was amazing. It no longer exists.
Wow.
That's the kind of people that I was dealing with, and it was a real pleasure to follow them on their adventures.
Yeah. So Tess has up here how to purchase the book. We have it at the Athenaeum Library, but if you are a bibliomaniac and like to have your own books on your shelves, you may purchase this book from Yale, and get 30% off with the code. So that's there in the chat. Ed is wondering if you wrote about Everett Augustus Duyckinck.
Yeah,
Duyckinck, thank you.
He's a huge, he's probably in a sense the major figure across all the chapters. He was a man of letters. He was the editor of the first he was the editor of the Literary World, published in New York. It was more than a trade journal. It was an attempt also to create the taste by which American literature would be appreciated. He edited in the mid-1840s a 2-book series with Wiley and Putnam, both of which publishers are still in business, but separately, called The Library of Choice Reading, which were European books, and The Library of American Books. And on the one hand, he selected and made available in cheaper editions books that were considered standard and classics of English literature. And then the American books, he commissioned original material from writers like, he tried with Emerson, although Emerson wasn't in the series, but Hawthorne and Melville. He was Melville's close friend, and he and his brother George published the Encyclopedia of American Literature. Everett's mission was nothing other than to stimulate a taste for American literature as its own tradition. And the motto he chose for his Library of Choice Reading and Library of American Books was "Books that are books." And it's a quotation from Charles Lamb's Detached Thoughts on Books and Reading. Charles Lamb's library is the one that I trace in my book as being scattered across the United States. And "Books that are books" comes from Lamb's Biblia, which are books that are no books. Lamb said that not everything in book's clothing qualifies as a book. And he lists, law books and books of statutes, encyclopedias. And then he names a bunch of popular authors who he thinks are really boring, from Hume to Smith to even Gibbon. And he says, I hate to see those thrusting out those phonies thrusting out the legitimate occupants on the shelves. So Everett was making a claim to say, look, we're giving you books that are books, pre-selected. Some today would probably find that offensive. But he was a huge Lamb fan. And he was one who gives us first-hand account of how the books from Charles Lamb's library, and Charles Lamb is a huge figure because he was a bibliophile who wrote memorably about his books in his bibliographical essays, like Detached Thoughts on Books and Reading, which tells you why it's important to read a certain kind of an author, certain kind of a book. And he gives us firsthand accounts of how wretched Lamb's books, what bad shape they were in. Lamb was the opposite type of collector who could care less about how beautiful a book was. He cared more about the author. So that's another kind of bibliophilia.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, it sounds like conversations that, can still happen pretty heatedly about what counts as literature. So Jim thanks you and says he's currently reading your book about the Keats brothers. And he wonders if there were any great collectors of books in England or America who were women, or was that just not done given the norms of the 19th century?
I really tried hard to add some women to the story, but it was the men who had the buying power. Women could be philanthropists, they could be authors even, but to form library collections, again, in the context of the collectors who I gained access to through Lamb's library, i.e. American collectors at mid-century who bought one of Lamb's books in New York in 1848. That's the premise. That's how I define my parameters. No, women were wives, and women are involved in the story, and they might be passionate readers, but it's always the man who's listed as the buyer. So, and very often the library is attributed, even if it's a shared library. Charles and his sister Mary shared their library. It was Charles and Mary Lamb's library, but it's always called Charles Lamb's library. Same thing with any Balmano's library. Robert and Mary Balmano shared their books, but it was Robert Balmano's library that was sold. So
that's interesting. Got to wonder what the wives think. They're still around after their husbands die and the books get sold off. This has been really.
Sometimes it was the wives selling them off because they were left without a breadwinner.
Right, and they had to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you hear like Charles Dickens, when his father was, about to file for, go into bankruptcy, that Charles's books were sold as he was a young boy, and that deeply affected him to lose those books.
Wow, that's a great story. I didn't know that story.
Yeah, that was, everything went, including his books.
Because that's also what this is the last thing I'll say. Sentimental collecting, which is the interest of my book, is all about you grow attached to a certain copy of a book. Maybe you've written in it, maybe you've left notes in it, and then you give away that copy because you think maybe I should have a fancier or maybe a more scholarly book, and then you just regret it for the rest of your life. There are more than one story like that in my book.
Oh, that's fascinating. So that's a good segue there to remind people again, in the chat section is a link for you to go and click on if you want to click on that and cut and paste the code YEBM30 to get 30% off from Yale University Press. If you would like to buy the book, you can also borrow it from the Athenaeum. If you found this talk interesting, I hope you will read the book. And if you are interested in books, next Thursday, we have Jesse Erickson, who is the Astor, speaking of Astor curator of printed books and bindings at the Morgan Library, is going to be giving a talk in person at the Athenaeum on Encounters with Ouida, who was an incredibly famous writer, a celebrity in her own right in the Victorian era. And she's the focus of his own academic research. So that should be a fascinating talk. And Jesse's another really interesting person. So that should be great. Hope you'll come next Thursday evening at 6 p.m. to the Athenaeum, to our beautiful space. And on Friday, March 24th, please come join us in person for another Allegro concert with Ling Yu Dong, who will be doing a J.S. Bach concert on violin. He is a student of Midori, the famous violinist. So it should be fantastic. In fact, Midori was the one who contacted and said, hey, this person is someone you need to have play. So hope you will come to those programs as they are coming up in the next few weeks, and are so thankful to all of you for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing all of you again soon, virtually or in person at the Athenaeum with a book in hand. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise. Thanks for joining us from California. Stay dry.